In the wake of Donald Trump's re-election in November 2024, Canada has undergone a sharp recalibration in both its economic strategy and diplomatic posture toward the United States. Triggered by Trump's reintroduction of aggressive trade measures, including a sweeping 25% tariff on Canadian imports and a 10% levy on energy exports, the response from Ottawa has been swift and measured. The situation was further inflamed by Trump's offhand and widely criticized remark suggesting Canada could become the 51st U.S. state, an assertion viewed across Canadian political lines as both inflammatory and disrespectful of Canadian sovereignty. Since then, Canada has intensified its efforts to diversify trade away from its southern neighbor. Yet, one sector remains tethered tightly to the United States: crude oil. That dependency, however, is beginning to shift. On June 2nd, the Canadian government convened a pivotal meeting aimed at accelerating Canada's transition away from U.S. reliance in oil and gas exports. But to understand the scale of this shift, we need to first examine how Canada's oil trade with the United States typically functions. As of early June 2025, Western Canadian Select, the benchmark for Canada's heavy crude, is trading at about $52.24 per barrel, compared to $60.79 for West Texas Intermediate. That price differential of roughly $8.55 per barrel exists due to WCS's heavier quality and higher transportation costs. The United States has long capitalized on this pricing gap, importing discounted Canadian crude, refining it domestically, and in some cases re-exporting it at full market rates. This margin capture has been estimated to generate the U.S. an annual economic windfall of nearly $19 billion. Canada's oil export infrastructure has been overwhelmingly geared toward the U.S. market. By mid-2024, Canada was exporting an average of 4.3 million barrels of crude oil per day to the United States, up from 3.8 million barrels per day in 2023. These volumes accounted for 60% of U.S. crude imports and were valued at approximately $130 billion annually. The vast majority of this oil moves through major pipeline systems such as Enbridge's Mainline and the recently expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline. In fact, in 2023, 97% of all Canadian crude exports, roughly 3.8 million barrels per day, were delivered to U.S. refineries. That kind of trade concentration has now become a strategic liability. Past efforts to create alternatives, like the Energy East and Northern Gateway pipelines, have failed due to environmental regulations, Indigenous opposition, and political resistance. However, the Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX, completed in May 2024, has tripled that pipeline's capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day, providing a much-needed outlet to Pacific Tidewater and Asian markets. Still, even with TMX in place, Canada has only one major crude export pipeline that reaches ocean tankers. And its capacity is already near saturation. The situation is not much different when it comes to natural gas. Virtually all of Canada's natural gas exports, 5.2 billion cubic feet per day in 2023, and rising to 5.4 billion in the first half of 2024, still flow directly to the United States, largely via pipelines into the western and mid-continent regions. LNG exports from Canada remain nascent. The Tilbury LNG terminal in British Columbia has shipped small volumes, about 0.004 billion cubic feet per day, while LNG Canada, the country's first large-scale LNG export terminal, entered its cool-down phase in March 2025. It aims to ship its first cargo mid-year, with a planned annual capacity of 14 million tons. Once LNG Canada becomes fully operational, it could begin to displace some pipeline gas flows into the U.S. Natural gas from Alberta is routed through British Columbia and onward to the U.S. via the BC-Washington Interconnect, which carries about 1.9 billion cubic feet per day into the Pacific Northwest. This brings us to the landmark June 2nd meeting in Saskatoon, where Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down with all 10 provincial premiers. The purpose? To fast-track Canada's shift away from reliance on the United States by overhauling the federal infrastructure approval process, especially for energy and mining projects. Under current laws, major resource developments can take up to a decade to clear federal hurdles. Carney proposed reducing that window to 2 years by designating select projects as being of national interest. In his remarks, Carney declared, "The point is to build the certainty, the stability, and the ambition that builders need to catalyze enormous investment, investment to make Canada into an energy superpower. He added that expedited approvals could shield Canada from US trade shocks and provide long-term stimulus to GDP growth. When asked to name early candidates for this fast-track designation, Carney identified several high-profile initiatives. These included the Grays Bay Road and Port project in Nunavut, a proposed Arctic corridor for mineral exports, Ontario's Ring of Fire, a vast but stalled mining zone rich in chromite and nickel, and Alberta's $20 billion Pathways Alliance, a carbon capture and storage initiative backed by oil sands producers. He also reiterated the urgent need for a second pipeline route to Tidewater beyond Trans Mountain. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, whose province produces about 70% of Canada's crude oil, proposed what she called a grand bargain support for a new, privately funded pipeline carrying 1 million barrels of oil per day to northern British Columbia, potentially generating $20 billion in annual revenue. In return, Alberta's oil sands industry would commit $10 to $20 billion toward carbon capture and emissions offsetting technologies. "I'm encouraged by the immediate change of tone," Smith said. "When we hear the Prime Minister talking about being an energy superpower, we haven't heard that language in some time." Carney welcomed Smith's idea, agreeing that a new pipeline should carry decarbonised oil and be framed within Canada's national interest. Ontario Premier Doug Ford praised the meeting as the best in a decade and emphasised the need to dismantle internal trade barriers. "We need to ensure that goods and energy can move coast to coast without provincial roadblocks," he said. However, British Columbia's Deputy Premier Nikki Sharma stood firm against any new bitumen pipeline through her province, noting there is currently no official project proponent and urging Ottawa to focus on shovel-ready projects instead. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew floated a bold alternative, a crude export route through Hudson Bay to the port of Churchill. While that northern port is icebound much of the year, he argued that with creativity and private investment, it could become a viable long-term outlet. Eastern premiers from New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island called for stronger natural gas and electricity interconnectors to improve supply resilience in the Maritimes. And while Quebec Premier François Legault didn't object outright to the national interest framework, he stressed that bilingual and constitutional regulatory harmonization would be key. Indigenous leaders voiced immediate concerns. A spokesperson for the Assembly of First Nations warned that any effort to short-circuit consultation obligations would meet legal and political resistance. Carney acknowledged that Indigenous rights are non-negotiable and promised meaningful consultation would remain mandatory, even under a fast-track regime. Environmental groups were also skeptical. "We cannot abandon our climate targets in the process," said a representative from Environmental Defence Canada, urging that new projects be explicitly tied to measurable emissions reductions. Carney pointed to the Pathways Alliance as an example of reconciling energy development with environmental stewardship. The outcome of the meeting set in motion a clear plan. By July 15, each province and territory must submit up to 3 proposed projects for national interest designation. Ottawa will publish eligibility criteria in mid-July and launch a rapid review office by early August to oversee 24-month approvals. Carney will reconvene all leaders in September to assess submissions and finalize a shortlist. The meeting came just days after Trump's announcement of a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, another sharp escalation that reinforced Carney's argument that Canada must build economic resilience beyond US influence. "We cannot allow external shocks to dictate Canadian prosperity," Carney said. "This is our moment to take matters into our own hands." And while Carney emphasized that Canada still wants to ease trade frictions with the US, he made it clear that the era of dependence must end. Diversifying oil exports beyond the United States will not be easy. But with the political will, the infrastructure blueprint, and a pipeline of viable projects now on the table, the effort to Trump-proof the Canadian economy may finally have a path forward. Before we close, if you found value in this breakdown, please hit the like button. It helps us reach more viewers who care about Canada's economic sovereignty. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should Canada build another westward pipeline? Is Churchill a viable export solution? Or is Carney's plan too ambitious, too fast? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more deep dive reporting like this. Thanks for watching, and stay informed.